There we go. This fellowship provides funding for artists, activists, musicians, writers, and scholars who are engaged in the expansion and expression of knowledge to help inform the understanding of women in MIT's history and in the history of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, particularly through the interdisciplinary lenses and methodologies of women's studies, gender studies, and race and ethnic studies. This evening, we will be hearing from Rachel Lane, who created the Mapping Migration at MIT Story Map, and from Soala, Ajienka, and Deborah Tsogbe, who will speak about their project Sisters in Making, Prototyping and the Feminine Resilience. Each group will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A period at the end. Since this is a webinar format, you'll be able to put questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. Closed captions are turned on, and you can select Show Captions at the bottom of the screen if you would like. This event will also be recorded and posted online later. Starting off, I'm pleased to introduce Rachel Lane. Rachel is a historian and writer who holds a BA in History and Spanish from Hillsdale College and an MA in History with an emphasis in Public History from Norwich University. Rachel?
Thank you, Tara. I'm going to share my screen. All right, I think we're good to go. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Lane, and I am a program associate in the Center for Oral History at the Science History Institute. If you're not familiar with the Science History Institute, it's a free museum and library located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that is dedicated to uncovering the hidden stories of the people responsible for significant scientific achievements. My role in the Center for Oral History is focused on conducting interviews of scientists and engineers and making them accessible in our digital collections and library. The Institute's focus of telling the stories behind the science meshed well with MIT's reputation as a preeminent institution for scientists and engineers and inspired my interest in the story map that I entitled Mapping Migration at MIT. Growing up in Columbus, Ohio, I was introduced to international students at a young age. A local Christian charitable organization worked with Ohio State University to help provide temporary housing for international students who arrived early before housing was available. My family was one of the volunteers hosting a number of international students, mostly from China and Germany. After the first international student stayed with us, I remember my sister and I eagerly looked forward to the arrival of our international student every August. Some of them even became our friends, and we welcomed them at our home for Thanksgiving. I'm grateful to my parents for providing this opportunity to my sister and me to learn about different cultures firsthand. These experiences have stayed with me throughout my adult life. When I first saw the 2023 Women at MIT Fellowship Request for Proposals, working on a project related to international women in science was one of the first things that came to my mind. Since I work in oral history, I was delighted to see that the Women at MIT archival collection had a plethora of oral history interviews with international women. I also knew of 2 interviews of international women at MIT that were part of the Science History Institute's digital collections. I submitted my proposal to highlight these 18 women in a story map entitled Mapping Migration at MIT, and I was delighted to be selected as a fellow. Incidentally, I received the notification when I was home in Ohio visiting my parents, who first opened our home to international students. My first step in the research process was reading through all 18 interviews. Armed with a pencil and some notebook paper, I carefully read each interview, highlighting interesting quotations in the PDF versions of the transcripts. I also took notes about each of the 3 sections of a woman's life: before MIT, at MIT, and after MIT. Finally, I wrote down my favorite quotations for each section in a woman's life and also jotted down some photograph ideas. After my first pass through the interviews, I began formatting the story map, again going through the transcripts. I used GPS coordinates to locate each section of a woman's life in its appropriate location and began formatting the quotations and photographs I wanted to use. This helped me see how the story map would flow. I ended up using most of the quotations and photographs I had originally penciled in after careful perusal of the transcripts. However, in some cases, I decided on another quotation or photograph that I thought more powerfully conveyed the message. I made a third pass through the transcripts as I began writing the copy for each section in a woman's life and adding that copy to the story map itself. Everything that I compiled, I put into a spreadsheet for the story map so that it would be all in one location. This included graduation year, country of origin, and hyperlinks for the photographs for each woman. Finally, I went through the story map as a whole, added some yearbook photos that a student worker at MIT found for me, made sure everything was properly cited and included hyperlinks, and sent the story map to Tara Webb, the Women at MIT archivist, for final approval. As I had planned from the beginning of the fellowship, the exhibit debuted on November 17th, International Students' Day. I am especially indebted to Tara Webb and Amanda Hawk for their support throughout this fellowship. I enjoy the bi-weekly meetings with Tara, Amanda, and the two other fellows, Deborah and Soala. I'd invite you to visit the story map yourself when you have some time, but for this presentation, I want to introduce you to all 18 women and share some of my favorite stories from their time at MIT. I was amazed at how long women encountered discrimination at MIT. Even as late as the 1970s, women like Aviva Britcher faced low salaries, and hers was the lowest of 18 postdocs. The rationale? Dr. Frank Press had told her, "Your husband was a professor in physics. You didn't need the money." We often honor people who are the first to do something or be something. Sometimes, however, we can forget the challenges those individuals face. Maria Burka was the first in some of her positions and notes in her interview how difficult that was. I've learned over the years that it's not good to be the first one. You take a lot of the heat. I loved how Naomi Carmon talked about her experience transitioning to life in the United States coming from Israel in her interview. As she remembers, our absorption into day-to-day life at MIT was very smooth, thanks to the big hug by the local Israeli community of students. Several other women from Israel also mentioned the importance of the Israeli community at MIT, but I loved how Carmon used the phrase, the big hug. Many of the interviewees discussed topics of discrimination and sexism. What I found interesting is sometimes when women visually looked different, they faced less discrimination. As Uma Chowdhury notes in her interview, discrimination? I never felt any at all. I would be in my Indian garb. You know, I wore a sari every day, so I looked different. The interviews I included in the story map span from Kathleen Morowitz earning a master's degree in 1946 to Barbara Panning postdocing from 1997 to 1999. And the experiences of the women differed greatly depending on when they were at MIT. Patricia Christie, who was at MIT in the late 80s and early 90s, notes she didn't experience any discrimination, but instead observes in her interview, "The chemistry department at MIT does a really good job of fostering a lot of women interactions." What I found interesting about Josette Goldish's experience of discrimination was that it didn't happen when she was at MIT in the 1960s. Instead, it happened at her 25th reunion in the 1990s, when some of the men celebrating their 50th reunion told Goldish and some other women to leave the march to the Great Court. She remembers in her interview, "He thought, of course, that we were spouses of MIT alums." Some quotations and experiences really stood out to me throughout this project. I was so inspired by Regina Hertzliner's dedication to fighting against traditional norms of the time to get an education, and stood in awe at the lengths to which she had to go. As she notes in her interview, "When I took my exams, I would never use my first name, Regina, but only my initial R, so the grader wouldn't know my gender." Something I discovered while reading through the interviews is that different departments at MIT also reacted differently to women. For example, Marguerite Kramer felt extremely welcome in the political science department of the 1950s and the 1960s, even though there were more men than women, 10 out of the 13 graduate students. Her only criticism? The only complaint was that there was no special John for us. Many of the interviewees discussed the important role MIT played in their lives years after attending the university. Maria Leanne's choice of jewelry was a physical acknowledgement of the significance of an MIT education. As she says in her interview, I wear 3 rings daily: my wedding ring, the MIT beaver, and a ring in memory of my mother. Kathleen Morowitz attended MIT in the late 1940s to pursue a master's degree. She encountered a number of discriminatory practices while at MIT and felt lonely during her time as a woman. But unlike Caltech, which only later started to accept women for graduate school, MIT had always welcomed women. As she notes in her interview, there was one very nice thing about MIT. First of all, they had always accepted women, as far as I know historically, but there were never very many of them. Several of the interviewees discussed the difficulties of learning or becoming more comfortable with a new language when they came to MIT, and it required a lot of extra work. Maria Moroni Yadlin talks about her experience in her interview. All of my notes were half in Spanish and half in English, but when we finished, I could understand almost everything. A lot of the interviewees talked about how exciting it was to be at MIT, where it was cool to do science. I love the example in Barbara Panning's interview where she discusses just how geeky MIT was. As I'm moving in and putting my stuff in my room, they switched it over to some local MIT channel where they deconstructed the episode of Star Trek. This place is like as geeky as it's reputed to be. I noticed when reading through the interviews that often an important mentor, sometimes a parent, helped women who were trailblazing new pathways and staying the course. Almitra Sidhwa Patel was no exception. She was the first female engineering student from India at MIT, and she believes it was possible because her father encouraged her to pursue science as a woman. As she says in her interview, "My eternal regret is that my father, who sent me to MIT, died before knowing this. He would have been inordinately proud of me, as I am of him, for his progressive attitude to women's education." Another common thread throughout the interviews was adjusting to life at MIT and in the United States. Some women had never experienced the cold weather of Boston, Massachusetts before. Raji Patel was one of those women. As she states in her interview, "I came in September, I didn't have enough warm clothes, etc. So now I make it a point through the MIT Women's League to donate winter wear for international students because I remember coming here and constantly feeling cold." MIT's predominantly male environment could be daunting for some of the interviewees. As Elizabeth Sajiel Sokalska notes in her interview, "It was very intimidating to come from an all-girls school to a boys' school. I was competitive by nature, and I was always afraid to ask questions because I thought, all these guys were so smart." I loved reading about the support from family and friends in the interviews. Cecily Shelby includes one of my favorite anecdotes that embodies this support. As she says in her interview about her mother, "When her best friend had a grandchild, I remember my mother trying to say very defensively, 'Well, it only takes 9 months to make a baby, and it takes 4 years. Actually, I took only 3 to do a PhD.'" Many women worked hard to get into MIT and sometimes didn't always get in the first time. Alina Shesnik graduated from Bryn Mawr with a bachelor's degree and decided to attend MIT for graduate school. As she remembers in her interview, "So I said, 'Okay, you didn't accept me 2 years ago. You are going to accept me now.'" Many of the interviewees reflected on women in science and their fight to be recognized, including Juliana Tesoro in her interview conducted in 1976. As she notes, "I don't see any reason why a woman engineer, if she's good, couldn't do as well as a man engineer." I have learned a lot through this experience of doing archival research for a creative work. It takes time to situate individuals in time and place. I needed storytelling to best convey the lives of these incredible individuals, but most of all, I learned that people are interesting. I love the opportunity to spend dedicated time discovering the stories of 18 different women who were trailblazers in their fields. Something I wrote near the end of my project proposal was that I wanted this story map to teach people about the experience of international women and the importance of their presence in academia, industry, and government. I hope that this story map has done that. Moreover, I hope this story map has inspired you as it's inspired me. I'll end with the words of Cecily Shelby that science is for everyone. As she said in her interview, "The messages I would really like to get out are how science should be part of one's daily life, not this subject over here just for geniuses." Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I'd invite you to drop by the Science History Institute for a visit if you're ever in Philadelphia. But if you aren't able to head our way, you can still listen to our oral history interviews through our digital collections or peruse our Distillations magazine and podcast that share the fascinating stories of science. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. After our next presentation, I'll put a link in the chat so that you all can explore their projects on your own. Next, we have Soala, Ajienka, and Deborah Tsogbe. Soala designs artifacts that have their bearing in material forms and transformations that cut across the disciplines of architecture, textiles, and art. Deborah is a design researcher and holds a master's in design computation from MIT.
Thanks, Tara. Thanks, Rachel. That was amazing. Great. Beautiful. So, the Sisters in Making project is an archival endeavor that reveals the multi-level efforts of women surrounding the invention and implementation of woven core memory in the Apollo guidance computer that eventually put man on the moon in 1969. MIT dedicated a tremendous workforce alongside its commercial and federal partners to perfect core memories. While we ultimately know the names of the first men on the moon and those who spearheaded the engineering initiatives behind the Apollo 11 mission, the names of the countless women who had a vital hand in realizing these feats has been missing from historical discourse. As such, the focus of our work has been to uncover the names and roles of these women who held important positions, including overseeing communications, checking codes, running calculations, and weaving memory. Through weaving this network of women into a physical instance of rope memories, similar to what you can see here, and curating archival images, will amplify the importance of this overlooked part of history. We're asking, how can we shift narratives of femininity to include the resilience and care necessary to produce such highly sensitive prototypes as electronic inventions require? So a bit about us. I'm a current student at the MIT's MArch program, and through my work, I address questions of design heritage, material vernaculars, and making in design practice.
I'm Deborah, a recent graduate of MIT's architecture computation program, and I'm interested in investigating cultural memory and persistence through computational making and design. I think that this fellowship speaks to my curiosity about how we frame and engage with the past.
So what we're going to do is we'll set the stage with the Apollo guidance computer, the AGC, woven core memories. We'll introduce Sisters in Making, as we're calling them, the women who are the subject of this research, the indigenous intertwined history of computers and weaving, and then culminating in our efforts at fabricating a core memory prototype with the names of some women stored. And our printed publication will have more information on this. So to start off with, the Apollo guidance computer. So Apollo 11, as a lot of us know, it was the fulfillment of a mandate dreamt up in the early 1960s that I'm sure everyone is familiar with. It was made reality by a cross-organizational team of weavers, engineers, programmers, librarians, clerks, some of whom you've heard of and some you haven't. But it's important to stress the complexity of the mission to make sense of the equivalent complexity and success of the Apollo guidance computer. Apollo 11 had a winding path that segmented the guidance program into manageable chunks. And this path necessitated two computers that would form the primary guidance, navigation, and control system. So in effect, it was Neil, Buzz, Michael, and the AGC. The AGC was called the fourth crew member for its capabilities and because it was fully integrated into the spacecraft. It was not just any digital computer, but a navigation and guidance computer with inertial and optical sensors. The justification for such a complex system was simple. It was to prevent enemy interference and reduce the load on ground controls. And the astronauts, they will play a role in operating the spacecraft as opposed to being passive passengers. It was really novel for how compact and user-friendly it was. Complex commands were reduced to numbers on the diski in the form of verbs and nouns. And a verb was an action to be performed, for example, display. And a noun was the object of that action, for example, time to ignition. The innovations in memory were a contributing factor to this compactness. The memory that would store the required information, both temporary and permanent, had specific requirements, like highly specific. It had to be light and efficient, complex yet compact, secure, and indestructible. The requirements for memory were the most difficult to determine throughout the whole process. And it had two forms of memory, fixed and erasable, similar to what you would think of as like read-only memory and random access memory, so ROM and RAM. And in total, it used 4 kilobytes of erasable memory to store calculation results in real time, and 72 kilobytes of fixed memory for programs that did not need to be changed during the course of a mission. And those are very infinitesimal numbers when you compare to the memory capacity of handheld devices that we have today. But first came Whirlwind 1. And for both NASA and MIT, it was such a learning process going through everything. The relevant technology was developing simultaneously as the Apollo projects were taking shape. And Whirlwind 1 was the culmination of research into magnetic core memories that was developing at the Institute at the time. So core rope memory then was electromechanical memory. It could not be lost. If you had an electric failure, it could still work. It could only be damaged physically, and in effect, it was software woven as hardware. So now let's talk about sisters in making. Talked into the documentation of Apollo 11, but rarely mentioned, are the women of different skill sets across partnering organizations and in different fields of work that contributed to the success of the mission. We'll be showcasing their efforts by understanding the different stages in the production of a core rope module. So once woven, these core memories could not be changed. That was like a very crucial part of it. And so it was imperative that the code was fine-tuned and tested rigorously months in advance. The instrumentation lab at MIT assigned people who they called rope mothers. And this was as a result of them being sort of responsible for the parenting of the development of the software. And they were to make sure that the software was programmed absolutely correctly. And Margaret Hamilton, as you can see here, was one of those rope mothers. And here she stands beside code listings of the Apollo guidance computer that contain results of guidance equation calculations. And after the codes were done, they were checked by the rope mothers and then eventually passed on to the key punch operators who would make holes in paper cards and key in the codes into what were known then as punch cards. And this method of coding can be traced to weaving techniques, which we'll talk about much later. And Elaine Denison is one of those sisters in making, who was a key punch operator for a while at the MIT Instrumentation Lab. She was responsible for typing up programs into these IBM cards and would proofread the code in the process. So prototyping was another significant part of the development of core rope memory. And in the documentation of core rope memory at the Instrumentation Lab, one comes across pictures such as these. There are evidently hands of women holding onto prototypes of core memory. Little exists by way of the day-to-day activities of the teams involved, but I think there's a statement here to be made about the delicate, tedious, and repetitive nature of woven memory fabrication that fell to those who were seen as having the dexterity and patience to carry out the required tasks. And so going through the records, then you find sort of multiple images like these of technicians, operators, draftswomen, fabricators, technical assistants, and engineers. And images like these, for example, are like absolutely fantastic to see because they're very similar to the processes of making that we went through. And this could genuinely be in the Building 3 workshop where we work as architects. And now in the next sort of few moments, we'll watch a short clip that illustrates the contribution of these women on the final side of fabrication for the Apollo guidance computer.
That's right. What about the memory modules? The memory modules of the computer are made using a basic component, which is a donut-shaped magnetic core. Now, this core will be placed into a component holder like so. Now, after the component holder has been completely loaded with cores, we're then ready to do the wiring. In order to perform the wiring operation, we store about 20 feet of wire in this needle. See how that wire comes out of there? Now, the operator will take the core holder and pass the needle through the core, round to the other side, and then weave it back through to different positions. Now let's watch how the girls do this operation in a little more detail. And here we have a pair of girls who are wiring the address wiring of the core rope module. Now they pass the wire back and forth, stored in the needle, and put it through the cores in a particular wiring pattern. Now each time the wire goes through, they must very carefully wrap the wire around one of those little nylon pins. As you can see, what that does is pull the wire away from the center of the core to allow room to pass the needle through again.
I see. Now these address wires go to every single core?
That's right. Now, when the wire is completely weaved into the rope, it must be terminated on a little solder terminal. Now, the girl strips the insulation from the wire and very carefully wraps it around the pin. Then they use a magnifying glass to inspect their work. Now, the sense wiring information, or the wiring that contains the program of the fixed memory, is performed by using this machine. The machine indexes to a particular location of a core, and then the girl passes the needle through the aperture and provides the wire to go through the right core.
She doesn't have to think about which core it goes through next.
No, the machine does that for her. Now note, each time the wire passes through, that little aperture jogs down and pulls the wire around one of the nylon pins. When she passes the needle through, she will trip the switch with the needle, which causes a tape reader to advance. There's the tape reader, and that in turn causes the choral plane to move its position. Now, after all the wiring is completed, these nylon pins that we use to temporarily hold the wire can now be removed. Next, we must press the wires very gently down into place so we'll be able to fold up the whole assembly. Now, this operator is folding the core planes into a sandwich type construction and laying them into the header of the module. Now we're ready for electrical test. We must ensure that every wire and every component are properly located. The operator puts the module into this piece of special test equipment, and a program stored on paper tape is then used to exercise the module.
But this is certainly a complicated looking maze of wiring here.
That certainly is, John.
I think there are a few things I find like absolutely hilarious about that clip. I think him fumbling at the beginning to do it, and he was like, okay, wait, let's go to the people, who know how to kind of weave this, core memory modules. And then at the end, the absolute complexity of the whole process. And I hope that gave you like a sort of a snapshot of what the work entailed. So every flight's program was completely different, and the program had to be finalized 4 months in advance before an Apollo launch was, completed to ensure that everything was completed on time. And Ralph Reagan, who was the manager of Raytheon at the time, commented that they had to build essentially a weaving machine. And they were called, as you saw in the clips, they were called kind of girls, they were called weavers, they were called little old ladies, and a lot of different names, but rarely would you see them sort of named directly. And a lot of them were from the defunct local textile and watchmaking factories that were local to Massachusetts at the time, and were renowned for their transferable sewing and fine motor skills. They sewed the software bit by bit and had to do it with 100% accuracy, with thousands of different bits. And in a way, the success of the Apollo guidance computer relied on this accuracy. Here's a moment where you see a weaver called a space-age needle worker. And in this article, they're sort of named directly. So the space-age needle workers, each one. So it's Vernal Norman, Caroline Butler, Helen Lennon, Edna Walcott, Mary Julian. And from the image, you can sort of clearly see kind of the working conditions that they were sort of, experiencing at the time.
And so while we were working on our archives, we sort of went about uncovering the names of the women involved in this endeavor. And so as you can see here, this is a compilation of the names we've unearthed. It involved going through MIT Digital Computer Lab personnel logs at the Department of Distinctive Collections, press releases, and other historical artifacts. Originally, we were focused only on the women directly involved in rope memory, but it soon became clear that the journey to the moon encompassed like quite a large net. In total, we've managed to name 534 women across 29 classes of work in 9 organizations, starting with the development of core rope memory at the MIT Instrumentation Lab. The AGC launched in 1966, and Apollo 11 went to the moon in July 1969, but by 1968, Over 1,400 total man-years of effort had been expended to make the dream a reality. And so the labor of this project speaks to the physical and mental efforts of the countless women involved in the Apollo 11 project and pulls from long practiced feminine traditions of making. Though it's hard to believe, all electronics we have today are still made by hand in one aspect or another. The fabrication of our core rope system is a reminder that these efforts should never be discounted. It seems a long-standing tradition of the technical fields is rooted in overlooking the practicalities of feminine traits, but there is a certain level of care associated with the making, troubleshooting, processing, and launching of any technical product. The undertaking of this endeavor shed light on the tremendous patience and persistence necessary to push a technical project towards the finish line. This core rope system is built upon the logic of the original AGC rope memory and modified to work with modern microcontrollers. With 28 core transformers, it holds 160 bits of information, or 40 words of 4 bits each, being carried along the copper wires to the internal logic of the microcontroller. These words are 7-digit numbers tied to the identities of 20 women who we uncovered throughout our research. These women are technicians, data key punchers, engineers, librarians, and office staff from MIT, Raytheon, and NASA. As an artifact, the memory dialer is intended to be a living archive. Though core rope memory is a permanent memory, in the case of this modern implementation and system, you are allowed to write and rewrite as you please. Rewriting here entails snipping the ends of deprecated lines and weaving new ones. If you run out of space in the memory or want to start a different database, you shouldn't be afraid to reweave your memory. This archive object can live on in perpetuity. As new histories are uncovered, the system can be rewoven and the memory carries on. The memory dialer is driven by 9 volts of power from the microcontroller, with each core being driven by a signal amplifier and 2 logic processors, while the word lines are tied directly to the microcontroller, being fed periodic pulses of power to read a signal. The signal being read by this iteration of the woven memory holds the names of the 20 women who we uncovered from 1962, integral to the creation of the Apollo guidance computer that took us to the moon. In all, it took 9 circuit boards, 50 pins, 50 jumper cables, and countless lengths of copper wire to build the memory dialer. These discrete components all needed to come together in the end to create a practical system for archiving, as we intended. The memory dialer is an homage not only to the original core memory of the AGC and its interface, but also to the hope that it represented for a new way of seeing the world. In total, the memory dialer as an object has already expended more than 200 man-hours of realizations efforts. These hours went not only into the placing of components and weaving of word lines, but in the management of its code, the research into its mechanisms, the interpersonal communication necessary to gather materials and coordinate schedules, and the mental fortitude required to make the conceptual physical.
So I'd like to say a big thank you to Tara, Amanda, and to the others at the Department of Distinctive Collections for accommodating our requests and for being an absolute support throughout the process. And they helped us to find what seemed at the beginning to, be like needles in a haystack. But I think to an extent, still is. But at least what we've done at the moment is sort of a significant leap at peeling back the layers of obscurity of the women who contributed to the success of the AGC, especially those at MIT and those at Waltham who had such a significant role to play in that achievement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. One thing I really appreciate is how different these two projects are. They show the variety of ways that these rich historical materials can be used, which I think is so great. Projects like these really highlight the value of historical collections in ways sort of outside of traditional scholarly publications. So we have some questions here, and please feel free to add things to Q&A. The first two are sort of for everyone, and then we have some more directed questions. I personally would love to know what the most interesting or like weird or surprising thing you found in your research was.
I can go. I think something that I wasn't actually able to include in the story map itself because it was talking about a faculty member at MIT that just didn't work with the flow of the story map. But Aviva Britcher, she really looked up to Millie Dresselhaus, and who was a professor at MIT at the time, and just like her model of being a woman in science and also having a family. But she said that Millie Dresselhaus gave her advice about all different things, including kids. And so this was her quote from Millie. "You can't have one kid or three kids. They're like electrons and atomic orbitals. They have to come in pairs with spin up and spin down for stable orbital. Either 2 or 4 is the ideal number." So that to me was just super entertaining. I wish I could have included it, but it didn't quite fit with the flow of the story map.
I think for me, it's sort of, as we kind of look through the archives, the level of, I guess, prototyping. I was not expecting that many tests to have been done for the like core memory modules that were used. Because I think a lot of the times you see kind of final products and you imagine that, people knew what they were doing going into the process. But then when you see, the levels of testing kind of I think it was extremely rigorous. I think for me, that was like the big, not a shock, I'd say, but a welcome surprise, like how much effort and work went into making these things. And I don't know, like figuring, just making sure, because I think they had the goal at the end, right? And that goal for them was very important, so it had to work. And so going through those stages, I think, was extremely surprising, and documenting them, yeah, for me, that was a big, it was a welcome surprise.
I probably would agree with Soala that the most surprising thing was the just sheer amount of effort put in. I think going through the personnel logs was the most where it hit home, just because like the pages and pages of names all across so many different organizations that went into helping making this original project a reality.
Cool. Had you done archival research before, and how has this experience changed the way you might conduct research in the future, or how you might envision creating a creative project in the future?
I think I'll jump in and say to like record every single thing. Because I think because in a way, I mean, yes, we had the material from the Department of Distinctive Collections, but we also sort of had material from people who had written books. And so they also kept records. And it's like, as you're kind of working on something, right, make sure that it's not just focus on the final, but like each stage of the process is equally as important, because, it's tedious. I think it's just recording everything, documentation, I'd say for me, with sort of work going into the future. But also I'd done sort of work with archives before, but I think not to the extent that this project required, because like Deborah was saying, like, going through sort of pages and pages of I think that the sheer amount of information was definitely very enjoyable, and not something that I had, engaged with, in that way before.
I'll just jump in and agree with Soala. I think that I had a spreadsheet, trying to document everything. And I felt like I kept adding columns like, oh, I don't just need a hyperlink for this. I also want this information about every single woman. I think what was unique for me was I had done archival research before, but it was always in collections that I knew very well. And so coming into this project, I was not very familiar at all with the Department of Distinctive Collections at MIT. And in some respects, it's similar to navigating other collections, but it was also different. So I think I was grateful to, the staff, Amanda and Tara, for their support in helping to navigate, and just having the opportunity to learn a little bit more about another collection was really great.
Great. Rachel, we have a question for you. Did any of the interviewees in this project talk about any of the other women in the project in their interviews, or did you come across any stories linking the different women?
So I was thinking about that. I don't recall any interviewee mentioning another, but I do recall a couple common threads. One is Millie Dresselhaus, who was a professor at MIT, popped up in a lot of different interviews. And so she was definitely a mentor to so many different women. So that was a common thread. Another one where I saw a lot of threads was the Jewish community at MIT. There were people from Israel and some other different countries that talked about like being involved in the Jewish community and just how welcome they felt. So that was another common thread. I'm trying to think. At this time, I don't remember any other like common threads that are sticking out to me, but those are two things I can think of.
Well, yeah, Millie Dresselhaus was really an amazing woman. Deborah Soala, did you find all of this information at MIT, or did you also research or interview people outside of MIT?
We were actually able to get some contact with like some people who worked at Raytheon, one retired engineer who actually worked on the Apollo 11 project that we spoke with. He was a big help in just like sort of contextualizing things for us in terms of like the amount of time that has passed and everything since then. And we also were able to connect with some individuals who had done similar research into the women of the Apollo 11 project, along with like, there's like extensive documentation online of the computer itself and the sort of making that went into it.
Very cool. Rachel, do you find that there is a difference between the information shared in oral histories and in more formal historical documents like newspapers or biographies?
Yes, I think that there are differences. I know there's a lot of discussion in the field as to how reliable are oral histories, and my supervisor always likes to say they're a source just like any other source. I think that with oral histories, people can be more aware of what's happened. They're aware that there's a conversation that's happening and could be preserved for historical record, where that may not be the case with letters or, things of that nature. I think the component that I enjoyed specifically about working with these oral histories is there was such a personal component. Like maybe this would be written in a letter, I don't know, but like Regina Herzlinger saying like, oh, I wrote all my exams with the initial R as opposed to Regina, so that like they wouldn't change the grading. Like maybe you could have like her exams and you would see that she was R Herzlinger, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to draw any conclusions from that without her telling you why exactly that happened. So I like the personal component of it, and I felt like there were, it was much more human that way, like things that I could relate to.
Thank you. Yeah, I would imagine that they'd be sort of maybe like a little bit more candid. Deborah and Soala, we have a comment or a question/comment that says, these videos are amazing artifacts. They remind me of how women are still hired and often preferred as manufacturing workers for microelectronics, for example, at factories in Taiwan and China. Are the videos available to watch on your site or elsewhere online?
I can take that. So we'll be having an exhibition starting in December. And the idea is that basically what we presented today is like excerpts from the publication, and then as well as the prototype that we made. So all that information will be in the exhibition. And then once that's concluded, all the information, including a lot of our archive, because what we were doing at the same time was sort of building up a body of sort of work that, and then indexing that in a very specific way, as you saw in the different slides. And so these videos and the different clips that we had will be available once that's concluded. Thank you for the comment.
Thank you all so much. It looks like we don't have any other questions, but we do have another question. Curious about the racial composition of the weavers/women involved.
Actually, it was a little bit surprising, given that a lot of this work was done pre-1960s, like civil rights revolution, that the workers are very integrated. I'm not sure about like, their other backgrounds or things like that. But as far as like the videos and other pictures that we found, it was pretty evenly divided.
I think to add to that too, the teams that sort of the images that we got from the Department of Distinctive Collections about the teams at MIT, I think a lot of the images was very much like Deborah was saying, like an integrate. I mean, that's the thing, we didn't expect it. But then you see like different colors. It was, it was very much a mix of people.
Great, thank you all so much for speaking and attending. I'm putting a link in the chat now to our research guide, which should take you directly, yes, to the Women at MIT Fellows page, where you can learn about the current fellows as well as our past fellows. And there are links to the Mapping Migration map, to the Instagram account for Sisters in Making, and in the future, a link to the exhibit, etc. And then a link to our 2021 fellows immersive virtual installation video game, A Lab of One's Own. If you do have questions later, please feel free to reach out. And thank you all so much for coming. Oops, hold on. We have a couple more questions. I jumped the gun. Thank you all so much for sharing your work. That's an easy question. And a question for Deborah and Soala. Do you know if elements of the woven cores were commercialized in any way?
Actually, the core memory, it kind of was surpassed by other types of memory technology in like the 70s. And it wasn't, I think one good instance of a commercial implementation that I found was actually a Soviet Russian number auto dialer, which like had a core array that you could like put in your own number in and like use it to dial the phone. But other than that, it was like, I think it was pretty cheap to use. And so it was like convenient for that reason, but not like glamorous, I guess, for a lot of people.
Great. Thank you all so much. And special thank you to Rachel, Deborah, and Soala, and to the Distinctive Collections staff for facilitating the research and funding the fellowship, which I think is just such a great way to see people use archival material in various projects. Great. Have a nice evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.